Stephanie Arell, and today what I want to talk about is related to a question a student asked me. It revolved around thinking about the differences between loneliness and boredom and finding oneself in social situations where they're experiencing boredom but not feeling lonely, but maybe feeling a little bit alone. So I had to give some thought to that. What is the difference between loneliness and boredom? It's complex, and as usual, I'm always wanting to think about what is the person's responsibility who's actually experiencing the loneliness and boredom. So let's start with loneliness and not look at it as a real negative phenomenon, which it really can be, and it can be dangerous and important for us to address if what you're really feeling is a deep sense of isolation from the world. What that leads us to think about is that being in community, being around people, that can start to alleviate loneliness. I don't think it's just being around people, though, that actually helps loneliness. I think it's being around people where there's substance, where there's meaning in the relationships, where there's sharing, where there's reciprocity. Now, if you find yourself in a social situation, and this was essentially what the question was about, where you do not feel a part of the group or you feel bored with the group, then there's some questions that one can ask themselves. One that's coming to mind does more intimately relate to loneliness, and that has to do with if there's a feeling of isolation from the group or a desire to withdraw, that experience requires, and I would say demands, a little bit more attention to psychological well-being and someone's psychological state. So are there feelings of shame related to that? I think that if there is shame, the desire to withdraw, the feeling, and I've heard this from guys in the military. So they go in there in Afghanistan or Iraq for a certain amount of time, or they're seeing massive human destruction, and then they come back to real life in the US and they look around and go, I don't fit here. That experience signifies a need for address in a deep and careful way, because it's significant of having a history of trauma, which these guys have. It does not just happen to men, and it does not just happen related to the military. It's important to recognize, because I think that when the feeling of isolation, social isolation, when one is in a group that has the residual of some dense loneliness, is really important to pay attention to, because it can lay a foreground for a desire to engage in self-harm or suicidality. And I do think sometimes when people look around and go, we can't believe that this person died by suicide, that there's often a recollection of their participation in a group activity, but really they didn't feel like they were a part of that group. So that category is distinct from thinking about boredom, and I just want to name it because I think it's really important to do so. Now, if we go and look at boredom, I do think boredom is a responsibility of the person who's experiencing the boredom. It does have its own indicators related to a sense of purpose or meaning. I'm thinking about boredom occurring in two different ways. One, you're in a social situation and there's a lack of stimulation. The lack of stimulation likely comes from or has its roots in not experiencing enough depth in this particular social situation. Now, that could be the burden of the person being bored, or it could be a realistic assessment that the social group is not providing the intellectual, the creative stimuli that you need in particular, or the student who asked me this question needs in particular within a social group. So it may also indicate that the creative life of the individual experiencing the boredom is not alive enough. So one question to ask oneself is my creative life alive enough? Am I producing things that I feel passionate about, that fill me with energy and passion? Am I engaging in those kind of activities that fuel me in a way that makes me capable of feeling alive, even in situations that may not provide the highest amount of stimuli. Now, on the other side of that, I can say I have experienced social situations where I'm in a group and the conversation does not meet the level of engagement that I would like. Sometimes that's hard, and sometimes I have to participate anyway because the particular social situation is either an obligation or with people I love. So they may not be providing me with stimuli, but then it's on me to relax myself and be available to them in some way, knowing that I have this creative fount of energy or life that's outside of this experience that I can go back to that provides me meaning. But I think when boredom gets really bad is when we don't have that fount or that resourcing that creates energy in our own lives, whether that's other relationships or whether that's something like, for me, dancing, for instance, or for others, painting or writing or hiking in nature. The list is endless, actually. And I think it's worth thinking about what is the thing that feeds you intellectually, spiritually, physically, that enables you to encounter a multitude of situations and feel alive and feel present. I think where the two concepts collide, loneliness and boredom, have to do with intimate relationships and intimate friendships, and whether those intimate relationships and friendships, and they can be of any variety. So it could be a partner, it could be a best friend, it could be a parent. I think that we can get creative about what we call intimate. And it's not even creative to say that intimacy is a thing that we share with people across our spectrum of relationships. Where those words collide, I think, happens when the flow, even if you think about creativity as some kind of flow between two people, is not as natural, is not as continuous, is not as rhythmic. And that can indicate a problem with the relationship, a problem with oneself, a difficulty with the other person. It can also indicate that one person has grown beyond the other person, and it can go back to indicating that one's individual, spiritual, physical life is not providing the richness for oneself. That lack can lead to a feeling of loneliness and or boredom together. If there's one takeaway from this video, which is a little difficult to think about actually, is that feeding ourselves, nourishing ourselves through stimuli that's intellectual, that's creative, that's spiritual, that's physical, and thinking about what we really need for ourselves can provide richer relationships with others. Thanks.